I didn't like it, but it didn't stop me playing on it, you know. I just played the way I played. I play emotionally.
When you think of Ringo Starr, what comes to mind? Probably that he's the steady, warm, and lovable heart of the Beatles. He was the anchor, the guy who held down the beat while creative storms raged around him. By all accounts, he was the one Beatle everyone got along with, the one who didn't hold a grudge. But what if that image, so carefully polished over 60 years, is hiding a much more painful story? What if I told you that one man, a man Ringo considered a brother, pushed him so far that he was physically thrown out of his house, screamed at, threatened, and left so wounded that his only response was to plot a quiet, calculated, and musical form of payback? This isn't a story about John Lennon's famous wit or George Harrison's spiritual frustrations. This was an explosion between the two Beatles everyone assumed were the most stable, the two who always seemed to float above the drama, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr. The story of their worst fight reveals a moment of betrayal so deep it's been buried for decades under the myth of the Fab Four brotherhood. It's the story of how the quietest Beatle was pushed to his absolute breaking point. So, how did it come to this? And what did Ringo do that was so subtle, yet so cutting? It's been hiding in plain sight on one of his hit records for over 50 years? To understand the explosion, you have to understand the pressure that had been building for years. By the late 1960s, the Beatles weren't the four happy-go-lucky lads from Liverpool anymore. They were a global phenomenon, and the machine that powered their fame was starting to break down. The story of Paul and Ringo's showdown doesn't start in 1970. It starts years earlier with a series of cracks that slowly chipped away at the band's foundation. The first major blow was the death of their manager, Brian Epstein, in 1967. Epstein wasn't just their manager. He was their protector, and most importantly, their mediator. He was the glue. With him gone, the band was adrift. Paul McCartney, ever the workaholic, tried to step up and steer the ship, spearheading projects like Magical Mystery Tour. But what Paul saw as leadership, the others, especially John and George, started to see as bossiness. This tension boiled over during the sessions for their 1968 double album, The White Album. The good vibes from Sgt. Pepper, gone. Replaced by a tense, fractured atmosphere where the members often worked in separate studios. Paul's infamous perfectionism began to grate on everyone. It was in this toxic environment that Ringo's famous stoicism first cracked. Surrounded by friction and feeling more and more isolated, he started to doubt his place in the band. He felt like his drumming was constantly being criticized and that he wasn't a real part of the creative process anymore. As he later said in the Anthology documentary, "I couldn't take it anymore. There was no magic and the relationships were terrible." Feeling like a total outsider, Ringo did the unthinkable. He quit the Beatles. He went to John and said, "I'm leaving the group because I'm not playing well, and I feel unloved and out of it, and you three are really close." To his shock, John replied, "I thought it was you three." Ringo then went to Paul and said the exact same thing, and Paul's response was identical. "I thought it was you three." It was a startling discovery. The band hadn't just fractured, it had atomized. Every single member felt like an outsider. A dejected Ringo flew his family to Sardinia to escape. In his absence, the other three Beatles immediately felt his loss. They tried recording back in the USSR with Paul on drums, but it just wasn't the same. They quickly realized how indispensable Ringo was. They sent him a telegram begging him to come back, calling him the best rock and roll drummer in the world, and telling him they loved him. When Ringo returned to the studio, he found his drum kit covered in flowers that spelled out, "Welcome back, Ringo." It was a beautiful moment, but it was temporary. The underlying problems were still there, just papered over with flowers. This event, however, proved that Ringo Starr had a breaking point, and when he hit it, his response was to walk away. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place in early 1969. The band's company, Apple Corps, was a financial disaster. They needed a shark to sort it out. John, George, and Ringo found their man in Alan Klein, a notoriously tough American manager. Paul, however, was dead against it. He wanted his father-in-law, Lee Eastman, to take over. This wasn't just a business disagreement. It was a war for control. The others outvoted Paul and hired Klein. From that moment on, a toxic Paul versus us dynamic was set in stone, putting Ringo on a collision course with his oldest friend in the band. By the spring of 1970, the Beatles were functionally over. John had privately told the band he wanted a divorce the previous fall. The world didn't know it yet, but the dream was dead. In the middle of all this, Paul had been secretly pouring his frustration into his first solo album, McCartney. He scheduled its release for April 17, 1970, which would serve as his public Declaration of Independence. But there was a huge problem. Apple, now run by Alan Klein, had its own schedule. Ringo's solo album was set for March, and the band's final album, Let It Be, was planned for late April. Klein and the other Beatles saw Paul's solo release as an act of commercial sabotage that would undermine the band's last official record. They decided Paul's album had to be delayed. This was the fuse. And who did they choose to carry the lit match? Ringo Starr. It was a calculated and honestly a cruel choice. John and George knew Paul would explode. So they sent his friend, the gentle diplomat, hoping to soften the blow. It was a job Ringo didn't want. He was pinned between his loyalty to his friend and his allegiance to the other two Beatles and their manager. Imagine that drive to Paul's house. The weight of that message must have been immense. He was delivering the final proof that the brotherhood was over, replaced by corporate politics. When Ringo arrived, he handed Paul a letter from Apple, explaining that the release of McCartney had to be pushed back. The reaction wasn't just disappointment, it was an eruption. Paul, fed up and feeling cornered, saw Ringo not as a friend but as an agent of the enemy. All his pent-up frustration over Klein, over losing control of his band, and over the slow death of his friendships, it all came pouring out, aimed right at Ringo. According to Ringo, the scene was terrifying. To my dismay, he went completely out of control, Starr later recounted. Paul started shouting, his face filled with a fury Ringo had never seen. He jabbed his finger in Ringo's face, screaming, "I'll finish you now!" and "You'll pay." Paul himself admitted the encounter was fairly hostile, and that it was the only time he'd ever thrown someone out of his house. He told Ringo to get his coat and get out. Shocked and wounded, Ringo left. The emotional blow to Ringo was severe. This wasn't business anymore. It was a deep, personal wound from a man he considered a brother. Paul later admitted he regretted that Ringo took the heat, acknowledging he was probably the least to blame and had been sent as the fall guy. But in that moment, none of that mattered. The quietest Beatle had been pushed too far, and now he had to figure out how to respond. The fight at Paul's house was the last straw. A furious Paul McCartney ignored the order, went public with his departure from the Beatles just 10 days later, and released his solo album on its original date. The breakup was now messy and very public. Ringo was left to process the humiliation. He didn't fire back with a scathing interview or an angry letter. He did what musicians do. He channeled it into a song. His response wasn't immediate, but when it came a year later, it was brilliant. In April 1971, he released his hit single, It Don't Come Easy. But it was the B-side that held his real reply. The song was called Early 1970. It was a musical state of the union on his broken friendships, and it's where Ringo got his quiet, clever last word. The song is structured as a report card on each of his former bandmates, set to a gentle, almost playful tune. He starts with Paul. Lives on a farm, got plenty of charm, beep, beep. He's got no cows, but he's sure got a whole lot of sheep, a brand new wife, and a family. And when he comes to town, I wonder if he'll play with me. Let's break that down. The farm is a nod to Paul's retreat in Scotland. Plenty of charm has a sharp double edge, and beep, beep is a direct quote from the Beatles' song, Drive My Car. But the final line is the killer. And when he comes to town, I wonder if he'll play with me. That one word, wonder, is the heart of the message. It's not an attack. It's an expression of doubt, of a friendship so damaged he's not sure it even exists anymore. This was the real wound Paul had inflicted, not just anger, but a painful uncertainty. The genius of the song is clear when you compare Paul's verse to the others. Next up, John Lennon, laying in bed, watching TV, cookie, with his mama by his side, she's Japanese. They screamed and they cried. Now they're free. And when he comes to town, I know he's gonna play with me. He references John and Yoko's bed-ins and primal scream therapy, but the punchline is completely different. I know he's gonna play with me. No doubt, no wonder. That bond felt secure. Then he moves on to George Harrison, the long-haired, cross-legged guitar picker, whose verse ends with the same confidence. He's always in town playing for you with me. The song's structure brilliantly isolates Paul. For John and George, there's certainty. For Paul, there is only a question mark. The revenge wasn't vicious. It was brutally honest about the consequences of Paul's fury. Finally, Ringo turns the lens on himself, humorously listing his own limited musical skills before ending with a plea. And when I go to town, I want to see all three. It was a peace treaty and a quiet expression of pain, all packed into 2.5 minutes. An explosion like that could have easily ended a friendship for good. The betrayal was real, and the hurt was immortalized in a song. But the story of Paul and Ringo doesn't end there. It's a story of resilience. Paul quickly regretted his outburst. Not long after the fight, he sent Ringo an apologetic postcard. A day after the famous rooftop concert, he sent another one with just 9 words. You are the greatest drummer in the world. Really. It was a small but significant gesture. But the real olive branch came 3 years later, in 1973. Ringo was working on his album, Ringo, and, in a brilliant move, asked all 3 of his former bandmates to contribute. Incredibly, they all said yes. Though they didn't record in the same room, the album became the closest thing to a Beatles reunion in the 1970s. Paul's contribution was especially meaningful. He wrote a song specifically for Ringo called 6 O'Clock and flew to the sessions to play piano and sing backup vocals. It was a powerful public statement that their friendship was more important than the fight. From that point on, the ice continued to thaw. Their relationship settled back into a comfortable, enduring friendship. They've collaborated many times since. Ringo played on Paul's 1997 album, Flaming Pie. In 2015, when Ringo was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist, it was Paul who gave the induction speech, calling Ringo his best pal. In recent years, their bond seems stronger than ever. They are the last 2 Beatles, the only 2 men on Earth who truly know what it was like inside that hurricane. Ringo has said of their bond, Paul loves me as much as I love him. He's the brother I never had. They talk regularly, have dinner, and still make music together, most recently on the final Beatles song, Now and Then. So what's the legacy of that terrible day in 1970? It's a stark reminder that the myth of the unbreakable brotherhood was just that, a myth. They were humans, subject to ego, anger, and betrayal. But the story of Paul and Ringo proves that those bonds, forged in Liverpool and tested by global stardom, were ultimately stronger than the forces that tried to rip them apart. The true story is one of fracture, forgiveness, and a friendship that endured. The hate, if it ever existed, was fleeting. The love, it turned out, was for a lifetime. The story of Paul and Ringo is just one of many hidden conflicts and secret alliances that define the Beatles. Their history is a maze of friendships tested to the breaking point. If you want to go deeper into these hidden stories, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. And let me know in the comments, which Beatles conflict should we dive into next? The Lennon-McCartney songwriting feud, or George's walkout during the Get Back sessions? So, did Ringo Starr truly hate Paul McCartney? For one shocking moment in a London home, it might have felt that way. The betrayal was real, the anger was white-hot, and the wound was deep enough to put on a record. But the story doesn't end in that moment of rage. It ends with postcards of apology. It ends with collaborative albums and shared stages decades later. It ends with two old friends, the last men standing, looking back on an impossible journey with love and respect. They saw a myth of the unbreakable brotherhood is easy to believe, but the truth, a human story of fracture and forgiveness, is infinitely more powerful.